So, our final panelist for sculpting images is Riccardo Villa. Riccardo is a postdoc researcher for the Department of Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Techniques at the Vienna University of Technology and a scientific assistant for the chair of digital architectonics at ETH. He holds a master's degree in architecture from the Polytechnic University of Milan, where he graduated cum laude with a dissertation about the contemporary mutations of the architectural profession. In 2022, he obtained his PhD with distinction with a dissertation on the role of images and architecture, so very fitting in the age of information. His interest revolves around images and techniques at large under a spectrum of investigation that spans from architecture and ethics to mathematics and theology. Riccardo's talk is titled Digital Epos. The stage is yours. Go ahead.
Thanks, Adil. Thanks Carla, thanks Lee, and thanks Nicola for having invited me for a second time. I'm very honored. And I have to say that the first time I was here 1 year ago, I put myself a bit into challenge. I thought, okay, what if I come to a conference in which, let's say, the main topic is AI, and I try to talk about AI by talking about orthodox icons. So I said, okay, they're never going to invite me again, and here I am. So for this time, I wanted to challenge myself again, and so I'm talking about Epos. But so just a recap about last year, so to continue the talk. So why did I talk about icons? So what was my interest? So this is linked to also what I, let's say, investigated in my PhD. So the fact is that my interest in the icon is the fact that it's an autonomous image, or at least an image that is not merely the picturing of a pre-existing object or of a pre-existing experience, but rather acts like a screen. So an image able to bridge incommensurable domains, mundane and divine, matter and light, energy and information. This is a bit a kind of a recap. And so the icon and more at large the image become then a sort of informational currency. So in resonance with my PhD dissertation that hopefully will be available in the next weeks in Berkhäuser website. So you're invited to read it. So an understanding of an image as something emancipated from object, so a kind of non-referential image. But not just that, so not just emancipated from object, but also emancipated from subject. So according to a certain tradition, and here I was quoting Pavel Florensky, which is I think, Russian polymath, the icon is an image in which the author does not really matter. So the author that paints the image does not really matter. So the author cannot really claim intellectual ownership over this kind of image. And the icon is described by Florensky is a fitting model, for precisely for this. So the painter does not author or create the icon, but similarly, if you want to, Michelangelo's notion of sculpture must simply paint what is already there. So it says, just as the spiritual word needs copists, so does the spiritual image need someone to reproduce the icon, the ikoniki copists. So the author here is simply like a copist, so not a creator, but more like an editor or a publisher or a curator of images. So it's not really a matter of creation, but of invention, also in the Latin sense of invenire, so finding something which is already there. And another of the paradigm that I like to think of the image through was the one of the garden. So both the image and the icon are, in this sense, an encounter between two different intelligences. So it could be human and divine, but also human and natural, for instance. So again, not in the sense of a creation, but an inventiveness that works through, in this case, a nurturing or an engendering. The garden is, needs to have, let's say, it's a kind of contract between a human intelligence and a natural intelligence. So it needs the activity of both to work. So this was, let's say, in very big lines, what I laid out last year. What happened in the meantime, so this is like, you know it well, this, amongst other things, also this happened. So, and I was quite let's say, happy to a certain extent to see the development of images in these terms, because there are, in my understanding, some similarities to what I was interested in the icon. So some features that interest me in the icon are present also there. So for example, it is an image that has no experiential references, but that sources its form from a domain which is incommensurable to its own, the one of scripture and of text, so of the textual input. And an image in which the author does not own, that is not owned by an author, but in which the author draws from a collection of sources, so a kind of canon that is cultivated in order to produce this image. So an image that somehow contradicts the usual paradigm of copy and original, and just affirms the one of, let's say, what we call absolute copies. So not a paradigm which is not linear, but probabilistic or more weathery, as we will see further on. So, but today, as I said, I will not talk about images. Today, I want to shift from the image to the word, and this is a part of the work that I'm doing as a follow-up on my PhD, and so it's still, let's say, a work in progress. So, taking again with a grain of salt, and I'm happy to hear what you might think about it. There are some experimental lines you will see. So, and so for shift from an image to word, and if the topic of the last year was how can we think of the image in the information age, which was also the topic of my PhD, the topic of today would say how can we think of writing, and can this be similar in some way as the way I was thinking of images. There are many sources of inspiration for this shift, and one of these sources was this reading that is a book entitled Il copista come autore, The Copist as an Author, which is a book mostly about medieval and ancient philology, but that nevertheless brings an assumption that I think is interesting for today. The title is already a provocation, so how can the copist be an author if he copies something which is already authored by someone else? Here I just translated for your convenience the table of contents. So the book, as you see, contains several provocations. So what is the original, questioning the idea of the original, the copist as an author, the archetype as a modest surrogate, and some other interesting tracts like the art of extracting extracts or the chapter on scroll and codices that somehow highlights what happens between writing in scrolls, which are always rearrangeable, and the introduction of the codex that instead sets a kind of a fixed order and removes the necessity of what today we would call hyperlinks between the scrolls that needed all the time to refer to the other scrolls in order to declare the order of the chapters. And there is a chapter of this book which is in particular interest for me today, which is the one of the library book, so the Libro Biblioteca, which is about the idea that a book itself could be or could act like a library. So but not in the sense of an anthology, so not in sort of a discrete collection of texts, nor of an encyclopedia, so that would claim, let's say, general validity, but a book that somehow integrates other books, and by doing so acts like a library. Within this chapter, Camphora quotes a passage from Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in which the English historian talks about the loss of books and the literary sources of history in events such as the burning of Alexandria's library. And here I'm just going to quote the passage of Gibbon's, which is, "Many curious and interesting facts are buried in oblivion. The three great historians of Rome have been transmitted to our hands in a mutilated state, and we are deprived of many pleasing compositions of the lyric, iambic, and dramatic poetry of the Greeks. Yet we should gratefully remember that the mischances of time and accident have spared the classic works of which the suffrage of antiquity has adjudged the first place of genius and glories. The teachers of ancient knowledge, who are still extant, had perused and compared the writing of their predecessors, nor it can be fairly presumed that any important truth, any useful discovery in art or nature, has been snatched away from the curiosity of the modern age." So the point of Gibbon is that, yes, many texts have been lost. There's been events like the burning of the Library of Alexandria is tragic, but in the end, eventually, we should nevertheless be happy, since these mischances and accidents spared the classics, so the important text for us. This has been spared. And then those classes are such because, precisely because antiquity has judged it worthy of being preserved, so copied in many more exemplars that would then more likely survive such kind of accidents. So it can be thus presumed that nothing of relevance can be lost, has been really lost. So there is almost an evolutionary, if you want, idea in Gibbon's statement. So one in which irrelevant or redundant texts get automatically discarded by a sort of natural or historical selection. And this is precisely what Camphora picks up in this book, by commenting with these lines, in which it says, it is the most serene view one can have of tradition, of the way texts are preserved. So much has been lost, but the great books, which were books of books, worked for us. They drained and put together what was worth preserving of an entire written and scientific civilization. So what I find interesting here, besides, let's say, if you want a philological interest in this kind of phenomena, is that there is a suggestion that there is a kind of intelligence at work in the classics. So besides this kind of evolutionary force implied in the classification that works, if you want, horizontally by selection and exclusion, also the classics are precisely in the sense that there is a kind of exclusivity to them. What Camphora seems to address is a kind of vertical axis that seeks to integrate or preserve. So these books that are the ones that are somehow kept, of course, makes it so that the other are excluded, but they also manage to, they're the ones that are kept because they are the ones that still preserve what has been excluded. And Gibbon's quote points precisely the attention on that. So the loss of the Library of Alexandria becomes almost a relief. So it is a tragic loss, only if one does not consider how these kind of library books, as Camphora calls them, work. And the library book is precisely a book of books. So by acting as a kind of ark that preserves what is lost, it becomes what Camphora calls also a great book. So its greatness, we can speculate, derives from the fact that in comparison to it, the sources that get lost become also redundant and hence negligible. So according to Camphora, here I quote again, the library book is the book that seeks to encapsulate, if not all knowledge, at least much of it, and ends up being enjoyed as a single self-sufficient book. And he quotes as examples of these library books, two main examples. He says one is the Bible and the other is Homer. So library books, great books, books of books, these are not merely anthologies. They are plastic, they sculpt the source, they absorb as an organic wall. And at the same time, they're not encyclopedias because they are self-sufficient. They are endowed with a kind of objectualities, whereas encyclopedias always depend on knowledge as something exterior to them. So there, I would say let's say to pick up a usual game of words that I share also with Carla. They are not just tools; they are also instruments. So these books, as I was saying, embody some kind of intelligence. They work for us, Camphora writes. They are not simply a representation of a certain knowledge, but they are manifestation of what we would call a sort of genius. And here, I would like to come again to draw a parallel with between not anymore the image and the garden, but the book and the garden. So this is Gilles Clément, Gardens, Landscape, and Nature's Genius, which is his inaugural lecture of the Collège de France, in which there is, let's say, a kind of architectonic disposition within the garden. So the garden is an articulation of incommensurable domains, the subjective one of landscape and the objective one of environments, and is a kind of contract with nature as an expression of her genius, the genius of nature. So, and perhaps we can stretch it forward and make a parallel or an analogy between garden and nature's genius and intellect and intelligence, which was something which I was somehow questioning recently. So what is the difference between intellect and intelligence, and what if the difference is something similar, or more than the different relationship, is something similar to what happens between garden and this kind of natural intelligence? So the garden and intellect, in the sense, organize materially and tangibly what would be instead an impalpable agency. So in the intellect, faculties are a matter of architecture on the way it is organized, like in the garden. It is also a matter of architecture in the way this kind of natural genius becomes organized and visible. But then I was talking about writing, and I took like a kind of side road. So let's go back to writing. What about writing? So we all know that at some point there was the introduction of printing, and now we shift from the printed book to the digital text. And the way I would like to address the digital text is not just a matter of, let's say, hypertext, but in this paradigm, so in the confluence between digital and digitable. So there is an interesting quality I understand let's say, the digital is the fact that the digital is always also digitable. So it's always open to this kind of constant editability. No? So if we take Latin motto, which says verba volant scripta manent, so spoken words fly, written ones remain, no? They're saying so, because of course what you speak is never really traced. Today I would say scripta volant, no? So writing has a kind of volatility of permanent editability. So there's a kind of confluence of actuality and potency, to speak in Aristotelian terms. And why am I so interested in that is because the confluence of digital and digitable challenges the linear conception of time. So with the digitable, I would say we shift from a thermodynamic in understanding of entropy, in which entropy is a notion that serves to distinguish the past from the future, if you want, through heat, to a quantum physical and informational notion of entropy, which is always, let's say, immanent to reality itself. It's not just about the narrow of time. We can discuss this later. I will not bother you too much on entropy, but we can also, if you have questions, we can debate it later. And yeah, so this challenges somehow this kind of linearity of time, which is something that, for instance, is described, if you like, by Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris. No? So if you're familiar with the novel, there's this famous phrase that says, "Ceci tuera cela." No? This will kill that, meaning that architecture will be killed by the printed book, because the printed book will be able to replace this kind of figurative function of architecture. So there is a kind of paradigm of linear substitution or a project or a progress. So you have architecture, the printed book, and now we can add the computer. So in which everything is kind of guided by necessity or by fatality. And I think within the digital is precisely this paradigm that gets challenged. So this is what interests me. So how to frame this new paradigm in terms of writing, and how to shift, as I was saying, to a thermodynamic, to a quantum mechanical notion of entropy. A suggestion, I would say, comes from the ambiguity present in some Romance languages. So in time itself, in Romance languages, is not distinguished. There's no distinction between weather and time, but it's always temp or tempo. And what I found interesting is that this kind of ambiguity is also present in the notion of writing. So in English, you distinguish between writing and scripture. And in French, you have écriture, or les écritures, as well as in Italian. So, and what I found interesting in these two concepts is that, so if weather, if you want, deals with chance, so with something foreign as something objective, then something similar is done by the scriptures, if you want, in the sense of the sacred texts that deal with an agency that is impersonal. So they're also written by or reported by authors, but they're not. It's an agency that is impersonal, if you want. Now let's go to the title of my contribution today, which is about Epos. So why? What about Epos? Why Epos? So this is a question that I investigated in the course of the last semester in a course for PhDs, in which also Agostino took part, my interest is like is as, let's say, three main points in Epos. So the first one is that Epic poems are one of the main examples of what Kamphora would describe of great books, so books of books. So they integrate and collect knowledge and foreign sources by in the way that I was describing, precisely in this kind of intelligent way. Secondly, they do not so linearly, like the encyclopedia or the anthology, for instance, but in a more weathery, climatic way. So it's not, Epos is not the same as Logos in that sense. It's something different. It's something more that has to do with rhapsody, with the waving. And the third reason is because even if they're not, let's say, sacred texts, they're not scriptures, they nevertheless contain a kind of contractual element with an intangible agency or with what I would call a foreign intelligence. So in the first lines of the epic poems, the ones from Homer, for instance, there is always a nod to the muse or to the goddess. And the epic poem is the result of this, let's say, contract with the muse. We ask the muse to tell us the story. So I found this as interesting guidelines for choosing Epos as a topic, let's say. So, like the scriptures, Epos is a book of books that organize it in a tangible and readable body, a dealing, a contract, or a covenant with an intelligence or a genius that is alien to the one that reads. And like the scriptures that are impersonally written, so Homer is not the name of a real person, but a persona, masks for this impersonal and diffused rhapsodic effort. And let's talk about rhapsody. So rhapsody, in terms of epic poetry, is this raptane, is this kind of waving together, is weaving together. So the scripture writing or epos is not a matter of mere input and output, but a matter of weaving. And here we see the figure of Penelope in the Odyssey. That's she waves this web during the day and unweaves it at night. So it's a kind of mise en abîme or precisely of what the epos does. So weaved and unweaved, raveled and unraveled. So there's these two kind of movements that are there. But this is not just a picture. Also, what I would like to bring here is Arendt's readings of Homeric poems in her text Introduction into Politics, where she writes, Homer celebrates this war of annihilation, and precisely by doing so, he undoes this very annihilation. So there are also as well these two bridges, but that express these very contrasting movements, but at the same time, they are very effective. So then it's a kind of picture that is not representative, but is kind of operative, precisely like the one of the icon. And Arendt's reading is interesting here because to her, Epos is a literary space. So it's not just a kind of, it's not just a matter of literature, but also of space. Because the one of Epos, the space of Epos, let's say, reflects, the literary space of Epos reflects the architectural one of the polis. So if we follow her reading, we discover that intelligence encoded in the Epos is the political one of the Greek city-state. So the equality granted to the heroes as peers in the Iliad and in the Odyssey is homothetical, is comparable to the equality of the citizens in the polis. So in that sense, the battlefield is the mirror of the agora. But this equality is not an equality as we understand it today, it's not absolute. The one of the polis, and consequently of the epos, is a constructed equality, not just metaphorically, but an equality constructed in concrete architectural terms. Isonomia is the equal right of the citizens of the polis that manifests itself in a special form. It is bound to the wall of the polis and abstracted from the real necessity, so the economical domain. And this really is also concrete as the oikos and the collection of the household. The political space of the agora in Arendt's reading is the negative one of the economical, a bit like in an Oli map. She wrote, a necessity is precisely what politics is not. In fact, it begins where the realm of material necessity and physical brute force ends. So necessity is somehow absorbed by the realm of the household so that the political can deal with the contingent. Necessity and contingency, economical and politics, we could say, are thus weaved together in the architectural fabric of the city. So two kinds of speech coexists in this space, in the space of the polis. The declarative one, we could call it, of the polis, and the imperative one of the oikos, of the economic. So we have a kind of more programmatic kind of speech and a more kind of, if you want, coding kind of speech here. I also try to think of this in terms of, let's say, imperative programming and declarative coding. So And the one instituted by the polis is a speech that goes beyond economic necessity, transcends it. So isonomia is the frame in which this speech can be measured without being the object of a political calculation. So this connection between polis and epos, or between epos and the declarative coding. So this is how I thought about it. And like the polis, the epos is, if you want, the garden in which a kind of intelligence can speak. So they all are, in my understanding, so these are all kind of models that I find fascinating, the garden, the polis, the epos, because precisely they encrypt or they kind of articulate this dealing with an intelligence which is, let's say, alien to whomever is reading or who is speaking. No? So there's something else. Yeah, so the fact that the political speech, so the speech within the polis, is emancipated from necessity and economy, does not mean that it's merely contingent, subjective kind of speech, but is also a kind of public objectivity in the speech, provided precisely by the fact that the isonomy of the polis allows for measuring one speech against the other. Like in the epos, the deeds of the heroes are measured against each other. And it is, however, not a measurement that happens against an absolute scale, but in which the scale is immanent to the measurement itself. So it is a matter of proportion rather than ratio. So like the polis, epos is a space or a domain in which words can be measured against each other. And this quality connects again epos precisely to the polis as a political space, so a space in which the deeds can be measured in form of words or speech. So the connection between epos and polis is one with the connection, if you want, between deeds and words, or gestures and words. And here, just a little, let's say, glimpse of Wittgenstein, which he says architecture is a gesture, so something that transcends the economical needs and imperative purposefulness, and yet does not deny them. So these are, let's say, three, to summarize, three chapters to come to a kind of conclusion. So we had the autonomy of the copy, which was my interest in the image, a quest for a kind of more weathery kind of writing, a kind of écriture temps, so a writing which is not just logocentric or linear, but goes more with the weather, so resonates with the idea of the digitable. And then the epos as perhaps a model to articulate and address this. How to do so? So the occasion to, let's say, test this kind of model that I was building in the last semester came with a proposal to work on a publication celebrating the 100th birthday of Fritz Haller. Haller is a Swiss architect mostly known for the USM Haller modular system, but whose work extends way beyond the scale of interior design. And most importantly, Haller is someone that conceives of architecture as what he would call a weaving or a joining of things after his master, Konrad Waxman. And also that is one of the first that has integrated a certain certain application of digital technology into building. So how to write about Haller? So how to make a book about Haller? That was my question. So, and how to do it so in the age of the digitable, so to say. So a way to celebrate such figure would have been to make a traditional history books, no? So a kind of analytical approach in which one or more contributors take on different aspects of the object of study. So we could have an essay to contextualize the figure, so to explain his Swissness, for instance, one on his furniture, an essay on the notion of system according to him, another on his idea of the total city, and so on. But this, I would say, would be a kind of classic or thermodynamic, if you want, approach to historiography. So now that Haller is dead, it can be considered as a closed system to analyze and contextualize within the instruments of today. So this would have been an effort to make a picture of Haller as closer as possible with what he really was. So this idea of the original again, no? So as understandable as possible to the contemporary mindset, no? And then entropy, if you want here, the differential, it would be then the differential between the past and the present. as something that would need to be brought to the minimum. So this would be a paradigm of optimization, no? The observation of the past has to be optimized as much as possible. So the kind of discrepancy between our reading of today and what he really was should have been brought to the minimum. So, but this I would say is a way of approaching history and historiography as a sort of death mask. So something that has to do with inorganic matter, matter that does not change, that is concluded and can be thus observed and determined once and for all. But I think so. With the challenge for me as a theorist and a part as an historian, would be then the challenge of the digital. Is that precisely that is not that? It's lively. So being digital, being digitable, the digital is discrete, but also open to continuous change. And this is also the challenge of the quantum. So time is not an arrow. So this is then, many of you who would already recognize the natural communication scheme from Elias Zafiris. But so not to make a death mask, but to talk to Haller, so to say, to sound his intelligence on something foreign, alien to us, this would be my interest. So not to neutralize it, not to try to neutralize the entropy, but to affirm it and affirm this distance as an instrument precisely of work. So to bridge, again, intelligence and intellect, and not to make a graveyard for it, but a garden. And here, again, we have these two bridges, one of waving and unwaving, like Penelope, or annihilation and a celebration, like in Arendt. But then, how to articulate this joining? So, and here I also, where I found Epos could be a fruitful paradigm, I borrowed from, let's say, the figures of Epos. One is ekphrasis. So ekphrasis is a technique that waves together text and image in a way which is not merely referential or representational, but more operational. So the ekphrasis is a way to describe an object through text and evoke this object through the text. And then that works also with these two bridges. So while focusing on a specific object, so working by exclusion, it integrates a word. So here it is the shield of Achilles, in which a whole scene, a whole cosmos is depicted. So by exclusion, it also works with integration, precisely like the great books. So it's completely is not epistemic or ontological, it's technical or architecture or architectonic. The other instrument that I borrowed is precisely the one of rhapsody, so the waving together of things. So not a matter of collage or putting things together, not a putting or addressing things as discrete parts, but a way to address things precisely in their duality between discreteness and continuous. So, and which is something that, yeah, here you see the 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius, which is precisely a way, in my understanding, to articulate discreteness and continuity in that way, because they are 10, not just because it's a partition, but because they somehow embody a mathematical model, which is the one of the tetractys. And I try to reproduce this double articulation in the organization of the project. So on one hand, we have a mathematics of joinings, Mathematik des Fügens, and a joining of things. So there is a part of joining which has to do with rhapsody, with waving, and a part of things which has to do with ekphrasis. So the first book would be Mathematics of Joining, Mathematik des Fügens, is a rhapsodic book written impersonally and waved together through computational instruments. So I'm working on this with Professor Ludger Hoverstadt. And the idea is precisely to write a book of books. So to use computational instruments to address a huge amount of books and to try to be the, let's say, the editors or the curator of this book, not the authors, by bringing together and waving together what is there in this incredible amount of sources. The other one is, let's say, the specular opposite to it, the joining of things. It would be an ekphrastic book in which different voices address, through their personal interests, the different objects, the different scales of other works. So it takes exactly the opposite paradigm. So then I go towards the conclusion, this would be then hopefully soon a book about Epos and architecture, so in which I will develop more the theory behind this, and with also a collection of essays from some brilliant students of ETH and of TU. So that was it for today. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. A couple things that you mentioned that kind of triggered a couple things that I'm curious about. I appreciate it. So there was a way that I started to think when you mentioned the polis and the oikonomia and isonomia. I was wondering, so, and then with your link to Hannah Arendt, there were a series of things that came to mind that kind of, I think, reflect on some of the questions we were asking earlier, or at least my interpretation of what those questions were. And I was wondering how we could think, or so if we could think of, because I've been trying to think, what is this, whether it's a manifold or it's a latent space that is somehow constituted by machine learning algorithms and corpuses of different kinds. And if that isn't, in a way, a kind of oikonomia that is articulated, and then what would be, at least for ChatGPT, but probably also for Midjourney, would be a kind of, which would be the art of the prompt, would be this vertical isonomia. Mm-hmm. When you get closer, when you emancipate from the tyranny of the household, as Arendt calls the oikonomia, into the freedom of the polis. Mm-hmm. So that in the polis you are able to speak in an orthogonal fashion, or perhaps with the imaginary. Mm-hmm. And if you remain entirely in, so this becomes almost an ethical, well, I would then also build another symmetry with, in the isonomia, it becomes an ethical question, or a question of ethics, whereas in the oikonomia, it's a question of morals. So it becomes there's a risk in the kind of total system of the algorithm that has articulated everything and placed everything relative to everything else, of a kind of tyrannical system. So in a kind of on the one hand, and perhaps an ontology, but also maybe almost an epistemology if it imposes a kind of way of looking at it. So that, I guess I'm curious to see if that fits with the way you're looking at some of those terms.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I agree that it fits more. It's more a kind of epistemology than an ontology. But what I think it's important is, because often like this kind of two paradigm, if you want the economic one and the political one, you could see them as antinomies, no? So that one, you have either to affirm one or the other. And I think what for me was interesting was the promise of these models, so the one of isonomia, the one of the garden, etc., is that, and I think this also applies to the computational instruments, is that it's not an either or, so it's a way to integrate one with the other. So that's also the idea of the books, no? So it works by exclusion, but with the next to the exclusion, there is also an integration. So the two things are happening in parallel, and one does not exclude the other. So it's not this if you want a logical paradigm of either or, no? So if it's not that, then it's the other. So both of the things are happening in at the same time, and they're waved together. So these two movements are waved together, and then that is how it becomes a matter of architectonics. So how to weave these things together, how to make a case, how to construct this model so that these two movements are have their own can be accommodated, no? And I think this is let's say my interest in looking at this kind of all disparate models, so very diverse models, and I found it always very productive until now to address all these kind of things. Yeah.
Maybe just a follow-up question. How would we think differently than today, in your mind, the notion of canon, from the classical canon to thinking in canonics today?
I think it's something that is becoming, let's say, we had, like, let's say, a more pop period in which the canon was not important that much anymore. No, so it was kind of refused. It was a kind of revolt against the canon, and I think now the canon becomes again with computational instruments on the foreground. No, so this kind of idea of curating a collection and deciding what goes in, goes out, and then precisely not being an author, so not giving authority to the fact of being the one that writes the original and not the copy, but by being an author in the sense of curating a garden or curating a canon, curating a collection, and letting it grow with time. I think that is what is becoming more of relevance today. And then the canon is not just that. It's not just a matter of curation, but it's also a matter of mathematics. So how things are translated through time and through different domains that are incommensurable to each other. So this is precisely also what I think many examples of today we were seeing.
Yeah. I'm curious about, so the first example, especially related to the Library of Alexandria, and the notion of the copy, right? That one of the curses, but also kind of benefits of the digital world is that copies are effectively free, right? You can make so many. And the sort of value system that it sets up in terms of what do we consider to be great works worth preserving, in the sense that if we just go by numerical numbers, then what ends up being preserved are maybe cat videos, Pokemon, right? Like as Adil mentioned, and pornography, right? Yeah. And so, like, how do we determine the sort of relative value system in a sort of world like this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think it has precisely to do with what I'm trying to articulate with this dealing of a kind of impersonal intelligence. No, so there is an impersonal intelligence at work, and if you want, in the informational paradigm, is what perhaps could be called objective chance, which is precisely, okay, if you have all this kind of multiplication of copies, etc., so at some point what get lost, and then it can be cat videos, but then who is this we that decides the cat videos is an impersonal agency, so it's not us that we say, okay, the cat videos must be saved. So it's something that is there in this cloud. But then the question is, like, how not just to affirm the absoluteness or the let's say the superiority of this impersonal agency, but how to make stipulate a contract or talk to it, so that we can then say, okay, I want maybe yes, some cats videos, but I want also to save other things because they're dear to me, no? And this this I think is what is possible today, in my understanding, with artificial intelligence, or where we're going. And this is what the promise of all these models that are more historical, if you want, the garden, the book, and the image, etc., they can inform us on how to think of this precisely, for this kind of contract. I don't know if I was clear.
I have like a couple of thoughts. They're not incredibly well ordered, but thank you for your talk. There were so many nice thought models to take away and think about. I'm thinking about the idea of the epos and the epic also as this kind of active moment. And I'm just wondering how maybe this feeds into this project as well, because on one hand, I mean, our setting right now that we are all coming here and we tell each other stories and we go again somewhere and keep telling these stories, I think is an epic setting of like telling each other these kind of stories. And I think like our current kind of academic setting has set up these kind of pockets for these kind of like storytelling moments. And I think that there is something very beautiful about it, is that like it does not become this like, or even if one does historiography about something, in the moment where you're presenting there and you're lending something a voice, this kind of like starts to live on, you know, it's not dead in that sense. And I think this is very beautiful. But I'm wondering, like, also in the Fritz Haller project, have you, or are you thinking about ways of creating these kind of like epic moments of storytelling, not on a meta level in the book, of writing about the epos, but actually of storytelling or of creating events or possibilities for these things to stay alive?
What do you mean not writing them in the meta level?
Because like on one hand, we discuss now epos, and there is a moment, or there's a certain epicality of the moment that we are in now, because you're telling us a story. But I'm wondering, like in the setting of Fritz Haller and retelling the stories that that come with these notes, the objects, the things, is there like also beyond speaking about the epos from a theoretical point of view, a way of enacting the epos?
Of
enacting the epos.
So I have to think about this, but the book, like let's say the Haller book is one book in which I will not speak on so there will not be, unless perhaps from an introduction, there will not be meta level. So in that sense, my idea was precisely to enact it and to do so with these two, if you want, escamotage, or with these two, how can you call it, tricks of the ekphrasis and of the rhapsody, you know. So and one way perhaps where this becomes more paradigmatic. So in the on one hand, so the first book is this kind of let's say a contract with the artificial intelligence as a foreign intelligence. And the second one is a contract, if you want, with human intelligence. So it's these personas, these people that talk about their interests through objects of Haller's work. But the way I thought this should be enacted is precisely by having them as personas. So in one case, there's even someone else collecting thoughts about from the people that should speak and articulating this. So to have a kind of, again, an activity of the screen, if you want, or the mask, no? So the mask is, this persona is not just transparent, it's not just someone telling their story, but they have to show up and declare their own autonomy in that sense. I don't know if this comes close to what you were asking.
Diego has his hand up.
Riccardo, thanks a lot for the talk. I'm curious regarding, so just something I came across recently was this Primavera painting by Botticelli, and how it's supposedly it was meant to be a pair with the birth of Venus as well. And then this Primavera painting, I found out it's a kind of a really rigorous documentation of like 350 species of flowers that pop up in spring. And then this garden kind of unfolds the mythology that is constructed and that is given birth to with Venus. So I'm just curious about this pair of mythology, which is concerned with the birth of things, versus folklore, which is everything except that, and which is the kind of the whispers and the screaming outside in the garden. I'm wondering, where does this fit into the scheme that you have built, or does it not fit at all even?
So you would say that mythology is with the birth of things, and then you have folklore is with the ghosts or something.
Yeah. So with mythological kind of stories, it's always like how the world comes into being. And the other is the world is there, and what happens within the world.
Yeah, I
You know,
don't know.
I don't even know if this is correct. You know, that's just my kind of
Well,
interpretation.
I think correct would be not the correct category to address it. I think it would, it's yeah, it's adequate. I think this is, but I didn't think through it. But of course, there is like a, if you want, I can give you so there is almost a cheap way to address it, that death and rebirth, you know, that the two things touch. Yeah, I didn't think through with the mythology and folklore and this kind of different movement almost. But yeah,
Yeah,
no,
just because this word lore nowadays is
yeah,
everywhere, right? So
yeah,
it's
no, it's
always
true.
in computer games, there's that. It's always like, how does this world kind of
Yeah, which has also
relate to what is
has to do with
happening
a
in this?
latent preservation of things. Huh? So it's like, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I'm not sure. I have to think about it.
I couldn't help thinking, well, brought to mind the way you took us through texts and ways of thinking about them. If there's a chapter in your book about the meme, right? Because the idea that it's something that is a unit of cultural information that is replicated. I mean, in Dawkins' case, it becomes genetic. In previous cases, it was just the idea that something is repeated and repeated. That fits in with your idea of the copy, and it kind of follows through this whole presentation. And it is something, of course, that we confront today all the time, and it almost it's both prolific and generative.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. The meme. So there's not a chapter on the meme. Perhaps in the new edition there will be. But I remember quite well that before finishing my PhD, at some point I was giving a course, I don't remember, and I had a lecture in which the meme was playing a major role precisely for the reasons that you were pointing out. And yeah, funnily enough, so sometimes when I talk about the image in my lectures, I still use this kind of classic reference of Benjamin's The Work of Art in Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in which there's a part in which Benjamin indicates how captions can alter the meaning of a picture, and the meme precisely exploits this, and also as well. And it goes as well with what you were saying with this kind of abundant repetition, and perhaps also connects with the idea of lore in a certain sense. So it's a pictorial or figurative lore. So yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah.
So I've been, I want to test something out. So I'm thinking about the idea of the copy as a model, but then if you just go to the to the meaning of the word copy, you always can challenge what is creation on that. So if you portray the copy as a model, which I think you're doing with the line of, I don't know if you're doing this, but this is how I read it. How will you? Wouldn't you like to call it something else than copy then? So it doesn't have so much loaded meaning on that.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
means
it might
that
be.
it really gives space for creation because it becomes the model that is very projected and it's
Yeah.
personalized and so on.
Yeah, no, it's great. But I think so. That's why in my PhD I didn't speak of copies, but of images, which is not a picture, because like a picture is, say, a painting of something. An image is a copy of something because it comes from mimesis, so a kind of imitation. But at the same time, whenever you think of image, it integrates the idea of copy without precisely making it so such a burden in the sense of copy, not original, as you were saying. Concerning creation, I think I always prefer to speak of invention, precisely because invention has this ambiguity between, let's say, as a kind of creative act, so I invent something, but invention has also, if you want, a more etymological understanding in which you find something. So you create something by finding something which is already there. There's this kind of oscillation which I find interesting. Creation always entails this kind of generation out of nothingness, no? Which is, I think it's always a bit tricky to address, because then it's very, it has this kind of divine act. So again, it becomes shifts again the weight on the fact that there is an author and that there is an original that creates something out of nothing. So I think creation is a tricky term. So I would prefer to talk about inventiveness or invention. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. If there's no other question, I think we can let Adil go.
Thank you, Riccardo.